I'm Dana Perino, and this is Perino on Politics. International tensions reaching a boiling point on college campuses across the country, but what other problems are bubbling up around the globe? Welcome to Perino on Politics, where we give you everything you need to know from a 30,000-foot view of this week in politics. Joining me today is partner and managing director of Beacon Global Strategies, my friend Michael Allen. And Michael, thank you so much for being a part of this. Some people have enjoyed getting to know, like, how do I even know these people I'm having on the podcast? Because I try to only talk to people I really know well, or friends that I have made who I trust, people that I would call anytime like something's happening in the world of politics where I need to get a handle on things. You're certainly on speed dial, especially of late.
Thank you.
Tell everybody where you grew up and then how we met.
I'm from Mobile, Alabama.
Wow. Never would have guessed with that accent.
I know. I mean, I've lived in Washington a while, but I still have a Southern accent. Though my friends at home say I've lost it. And I was just into politics from an early age, from when I was about 16, and I watched the wall come down in Tiananmen Square and just moved up to Washington as soon as I could. And you and I met when I was
Who did you work for on Capitol Hill?
So I worked for Senator Jeff Sessions for a little while. And then I went to law school at Alabama. And then I came back up to Washington. I didn't want to be a lawyer, but I got a volunteer gig at the Bush-Cheney Transition Office. Well, long story short, I ended up at the National Security Council. And when you were deputy press secretary, you and I were constantly working together to explain the president's counterterrorism and intelligence policies to the press corps. So that's when we hit it off and have remained close ever since.
It was an incredible friendship, and a lot of those friendships were just forged in fire.
That's right.
And it was a pleasure to work with you, and even better to be your friend. So in segment one, I wanted to talk about some of the big geopolitical hotspots that are going on around the world, maybe have you take us on a little tour of your brain around the world. I'll turn it over to you to start with whichever conflict you think is maybe the most pressing. One thing that we always say when we work in a White House, and this is not just somebody who works in a White House, a lot of people say this: the problems of the world end up on the Oval Office desk.
That's right.
And for whoever the president of the United States is, for however long we want to have that leadership position. But it comes with responsibilities and consequences. So with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, Dana, I think what's unique about this particular period of history is not that we have regional tensions in different parts of the world. It's that we have profound tensions and potential conflagrations in three different theaters at the same time. The Middle East, of course, is a big issue. You saw Iran and Israel nearly come to sustained warlike blows recently, in addition to the terrorist attacks. We have Russia, which is newly re-energized, beginning to make some incremental progress against Ukraine, but basically that's threatening to Europe. And in Asia, tensions increase with China, particularly of late, as they bully our allies, especially the Philippines. And so there's three things going on in three key theaters of the world. And I think that's what's unique.
When we worked together, we worked for President Bush. And I always try to remind people that in the 2000 campaign, neither President Bush nor Al Gore, as candidates, were ever asked a single question about Al-Qaeda in the run-up to that election. Now, all of us, of course, know who Al-Qaeda is. And some of these conflicts, it was interesting to talk about the Middle East and the bombs that are going back and forth, the missiles between Israel and Iran, and they're going over Iraq.
Yeah.
Back and forth. And I mentioned to someone, like, Iraq, for all the things that it's gone through, that country has kind of stabilized, I believe, as it didn't get involved on either side. They're like maintaining their own, they got plenty of their own problems that they're trying to deal with, trying to be responsible there. It's interesting also about how the domestic politics of both America's election and Israel's election seems to be weighing in on what the right geopolitical decision is right now.
Yeah, well, first, you're exactly right about Iraq. Iraq is hanging in there. There is substantial influence from our adversary, Iran, and there are definitely militias and things that we're not thrilled about inside of Iraq. But by and large, they're holding on, and we hope that they'll continue to make some progress towards a sturdy democracy. But you're exactly right. The domestic politics of Israel have definitely been dictating, I think, the Biden administration's views and attitude toward Israel, especially on what policy prescriptions they should follow. They are trying to have it both ways. On the one hand, they have sworn that we will support Israel no matter what, while at the same time, especially the vice president, are really out there criticizing them and their conduct of the war campaign in such a unhelpful way that I believe that it's given Hamas the ability to not compromise over the hostages and to drive a harder bargain, because what they perceive is that Israel is out there on the hot seat, and why should they feel like they have any duty to come and rescue, when the Biden administration is being so critical of Israel. So I think the domestic politics are dictating some of what the Biden administration is up to, and I don't think it furthers our ultimate policy goals.
Then take us into the Ukraine-Russia war. I mean, it's been my position that I agree with helping Ukraine, absolutely. What I do think has happened in the past 2 years, though, is that Biden said, yes, we want to help them, but it's like holding back the tools that they needed in order to win until eventually giving them to them. And it's like they want them to lose very slowly.
Yeah.
Rather than having a decisive win. Where are we right now with Russia and Ukraine?
So I agree with you that the real criticism of the Biden administration is that they've piecemealed assistance to the Ukrainians since the beginning. I mean, as you said, they want them to stay in the fight, but not win it. And I think that is a legitimate criticism that many of us on the right have made of the Biden administration. But on the whole, I think that the Republicans in the Congress did the right thing by voting for the Ukraine assistance. Much of that money remains in the United States, but also Russia was beginning to make incremental tactical gains moving westward. And I think President Trump probably made an assessment that if I'm going to win and if I want to end this conflict after January 20th, 2025, I need Ukraine not to be bowled over and being rolled over as the Russian army heads westward to threaten NATO. I think the assistance from the United States is coming just in the nick of time, because what Putin wants to do, and I think arguably he's already done, is he's begun a major Russian offensive against Ukraine. He wants to embarrass the United States. He wants to embarrass President Biden as we head into a NATO summit this summer. And I think we needed to get this assistance to the Ukrainians so that they can hold on. By the way, Russia is still a major adversary of the United States. And if Ukraine keeps them occupied, I think that helps our national security position.
Where do you sit on the debate about China's thinking in regard to Taiwan and our national election of October of 2024? November. Let me not get ahead of myself. November 2024. Is China more or less likely to want to make a move here while Biden is in office? Or am I thinking just way too simplistically about our own domestic politics and what China's thinking?
No, I don't think you're acting this simplistically at all. There are a lot of people out there looking at where China is, and they're thinking, wow, China has a real advantage here for another year or two until the United States has completely reset the theater, so to speak, which means putting more U.S. troops and arming Taiwan. And so there's a whole school of thought out there that China might be wiser to go ahead and go for it and try to take Taiwan now. I'm still, however, of the view that it is a big decision that Xi Jinping is going to have to make. He wants to be completely assured of victory. I don't think he believes that he has his forces ready to take a very daring cross-straits invasion, one infinitely more complicated than the D-Day invasion across the English Channel. So he is waiting, I believe, until at least 2027. But he's looking at our election. He's trying to figure out our politics, and he's trying to figure out whether the United States is steadfast. Will it stand by our allies in Europe? And what does that mean for Asia?
Yeah.
Will Biden stand by Taiwan, or would Trump? I've seen some quotes from Trump that indicate that he may not believe that Taiwan, or at least the national defense of Taiwan, is worth it. So there's a lot to consider when you're Xi Jinping.
Let me take you on a little tour of the world for a short Q&A. North Korea, still a concern. We used to hear a lot about North Korea. Have they been quiet, or have we been quiet about North Korea?
They have not been quiet. We don't have as much to say anymore because we've tried so many different policy prescriptions against North Korea, and none of them have really worked. We were unable to roll back their nuclear program, but they are out there helping the Russians, trying to keep the Russians in the fight against Ukraine, and they are making more and more belligerent statements toward South Korea. So it's great that it's on your list. It's something to watch closely.
How about the continent of Africa? That's obviously a huge question. There's so many things in Africa, right? There's conflicts, there's opportunity, there's amazing growth that's happening, population growth in particular. I was in Rwanda a year ago this month. I was so impressed.
Right.
But then you look at Sudan, you think, oh my gosh, what is happening? There's a lot of rare earths. There's a lot of young people. There's a lot of opportunity. China's there. We talked about Africa a lot in the Bush administration. It's been pretty quiet, I think, during the Biden administration.
I think so, too. I think the Biden administration haven't had the success that George W. Bush had when he saved millions of lives of people that would potentially have died because of HIV or AIDS or malaria and the rest. And so I think Africa is hit or miss. What I'm wondering and worried about the most, however, is that as we put pressure on terrorist groups around the earth, many of them are now popping up, especially in northern Africa. And of course, Somalia still has a presence there. I know that you're keen on making sure that people understand that the threat from Islamic extremism is still out there. And I worry that they're headed towards the ungoverned spaces, especially in northern Africa, and that is another task that the United States has to continue.
Well, and just last week, it was very quiet, but the government of Niger said adios to America. They wanted us out, and we left.
You're exactly right. Another mishandled relationship, I think, from the Biden administration. We are increasingly handicapped in our ability to put forward sort of expeditionary forces that have drones and intelligence collection capabilities in order to monitor what terrorist groups are up to. That's certainly the case in Afghanistan, of course, all because of the way we got out of that country so quickly. Yeah. But yeah, it's definitely something I'm worried about.
What about South America, Central and South America, where Kamala Harris, the vice president, the border czar, was supposedly going to do something about the root causes? She's not the only one. Other presidencies have said we have to deal with the root causes, mostly of corruption and problems of that nature. There's no rule of law. And now you have a southern border crisis that is having domestic implications here. When I read about what's going on in a lot of the Central and South American countries, it's very troubling. You have very leftist governments being put in power that don't share our values at all.
At all. And their failed policies are ultimately the reason people head northward. I mean, let's look no farther than Venezuela. When you really dive into who are the new entrants to the United States, the illegal immigrants who've come on in the last 3 years, many, many hundreds of thousands have been of Venezuelan descent or Venezuelan. And the reason is the economy is in such terrible shape. It's socialist. I think many of these Latin American refugees, if you will, understand that socialism is a losing philosophy and a losing style of governance, and they're headed our way. You know, I think if Trump is elected, and increasingly, even if Biden somehow hangs on for a second term, our entire policy towards the hemisphere, I think, is going to become migration focused. It's going to be, hey, you know what? Maybe we won't put sanctions back on you, Venezuela, if you cooperate with us and allow us to repatriate some of the immigrants.
Yeah, they won't even take their own people back.
They won't even do it. The Biden administration's mishandled Maduro, the terrible dictator down there. But I even see Trump and others beginning to say, we'll shift our relationships with you and make them better if you do more to stop the people pipeline headed north.
Amazing. My last area to talk about before we go take a quick break is Haiti. I've been talking to you about Haiti for a couple of years, keeping my eye on it. I'm like, this is about to be a failed state, and they're not that far off of our shore. And the Biden administration asked everyone around the world, could you please help Haiti? And everyone turned them down, except for the Kenyans.
Yeah.
The Kenyans said, yeah, we'll travel halfway around the world to try to deal with the situation of complete and total lawlessness, where you have now the dictator wannabe barbecue, who is a gang leader, basically. There's no government there. What should we do?
I think there's no governance whatsoever. I think it's another multinational force of peacekeepers that don't include Americans, I think, should take the lead. This is, though, sort of emblematic of where we are in the world, though. Unless the United States steps up and organizes something, no one else steps up to take the work. I mean, the French have some colonial legacy there. They should be doing more. The Canadians at one point were going to do more. But, Dana, you've been right to talk about it on the air so much. I think it is already probably a failed state.
Yeah.
You're starting to see the migrants come through Mexico that are of Haitian descent. And so this is a crisis that is already upon us, and it's just the failure of governance across not only Latin America, but of course the Caribbean as well.
To end this segment on a high note, is there a part of the world that's doing well?
I think the United States is still ahead in some of the really tough technology areas that are going to define our future with China, namely artificial intelligence.
All right. We'll be right back with more Perino on Politics. And we're back with Perino on Politics. Michael Allen is my guest. I want to switch now to how foreign policy affects the 2024 election for presidential candidates, as well as House and Senate. But first, let me start with this. We had a big fight in the Congress about foreign aid for Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. Ultimately, that got across the finish line, but it was very close. The Speaker of the House could actually end up losing his job over it because a couple of people are angry. How do you explain to people why we should care about foreign aid and the minuscule part of the budget? Now, I'm saying that and I'm hesitating. Why? Because it is only, point something % of our GDP, but it's still a lot of money. And we do have people in America going, hello, what about us right here at home? And I've been hearing a version of that since I was a little kid interested in foreign policy or in politics. I came to be a bigger believer in foreign aid over time because I think it's a good investment. But there's obviously some real frustration on behalf of the American people. How do you talk about it?
So I try to talk about it in terms of the common history all of us share, which is that world wars have tended to start in Europe, and that the later the United States gets involved, the worst things have become before we intervene. And so in this case, when you have a dictator, an adversary like Vladimir Putin, who looks more like Stalin or Hitler than not, moving and terrorizing his neighbors, I think it's in the U.S. national interest to spend some amount of money to defang the way he's moving forward. And so the statistic from the Reagan poll that I like the most is that when voters are told or informed that 3% of what we spend annually on defense has been dedicated to Ukraine, and that much of that actually stays in the United States because it's Americans who are building the armaments and tanks that we send to Ukraine, I think the numbers shoot up remarkably of people that support it. The truth of the matter is that we are in a age of geopolitical competition. We have near peer adversaries, not only with China, but also with Russia. We're a great country. We need to be able to be present in the major theaters across the earth to make sure that we protect our interests, and ensuring that Europe and NATO don't collapse or get into a world war is in our core national interest. And that's why we have to stay involved, so that we don't have to send U.S. troops to Europe again in the foreseeable future.
How important is trade to our relationships with our allies?
It's very important. I think that we once said things like countries that trade together don't go to war with each other. I think that's less true today, but there is something to that, which is when you have deep economic relations with other countries and other regions, you're more likely to try and work out your problems and your issues. And while free trade, I think, has definitely not worked for many, especially in the Midwest and certainly among manufacturing, the manufacturing base of this country, we rely on international trade for literally millions of jobs here in the United States. And so we have to be very careful going forward when we talk about tariffs and when we talk about trade wars, because at some level, we're cutting off our nose to spite our face.
And not to mention raising prices for American consumers.
That too.
There would also be that. How much do you think foreign policy will play a role in the 2024 election for the presidential contest?
It usually isn't a top tier issue unless we're in a major war or conflict across the globe. But so I don't put it in the top tier with immigration and with the economy. But I do sort of put it in a second tier issue, because I think Trump's kind of got a powerful message, which is under President Biden, the world is blowing up. That's simple to understand. I think people get it. I think also that Republican voters and independent voters rightfully look back on the horrible way in which Biden arrogantly, my way or the highway, got us out of Afghanistan, has colored the way the world has looked at the Biden administration. And I think that's a point that people understand when they look across the globe and see all the different fights and conflicts going on. They may believe, and I hope they believe, that the United States is still a force for good and someone that can help intervene, and not with troops, by the way, but with our influence, and be a force for good. But I think people are going to look at the Biden administration and see this as part of the general incompetence across the board.
Do you think that foreign policy will affect the U.S. Senate races?
Not any per se. I think it's an issue that's out there, but what I really believe is that economic matters, generally immigration in particular, are at the top of the list, and foreign affairs is in there, just sort of I don't like the state of the world. I do like Dave McCormick and others, though, talking a lot about China. Mike Rogers in Michigan as well. Two Senate candidates who have enormous national security backgrounds. They are very powerful would be very powerful senators. And I hope they continue to talk about the China threat and have a positive influence on the GOP generally as we try to figure out how are we going to deal with this generational struggle posed by the Chinese Communist Party.
And there's a lot of veterans running too, which is adds something. There's one issue I haven't brought up. And if this was a podcast by somebody that wasn't me, they might have brought it up first and foremost because I thought it was the most important issue. But how does climate change and the issue of climate change affect our foreign policy relationships?
So I think that it's a big issue for the Europeans. And even though we as Republicans have generally been more skeptical about the science, and then maybe once the science was settled, we were more skeptical about one-size-fits-all solutions. I have argued in just sort of private conservative circles that we all need to at least bone up on the science and the policy response, because Europe cares about it. It is an issue with China. Decarbonization is an international issue as well. So I don't think we should ignore it. I think we should be able to engage on it. And while we have an all of the above energy strategy and we want America to have energy independence from the rest of the world. I don't think we need to completely turn our back on all of these international fora and conversations that are going on, because when we're not involved in the conversation, they come up with worse policy outcomes.
Yeah, exactly.
And so
I know.
we got to be there. We got to be there at the table, or we're on the menu.
A quick question before we take our second break. Where is a good place for people who listen to this podcast to get more of their foreign policy news? Is there any place that you recommend that you really like?
Yes, I'll tweet out several of my favorite sources that I follow every night on Twitter. There are so many different good ones. I spend a couple of hours each night going through it all. It's incredible, and there are a bunch of good sources, and I'll put them out.
Great, and tell people where to find you on X.
I am at Michael Allen JMA.
JMA. Here we go. All right, we'll be right back with more Perino on Politics. And welcome back to Perino on Politics. Michael, this is a quick segment that we do at the end, but I like to talk to my smart friends because I always feel like for as much as I'm paying attention to things, I'm always missing something. When it comes to how you look at politics right now, what are you paying attention to that I might be missing?
Well, I'm worried about a Russian counteroffensive in Ukraine. I'm worried about what the Russians will do this summer when we celebrate the 75th anniversary of NATO in Washington, D.C., in one of the larger summits that the United States or anyone has hosted in a number of years. I think they're going to come at us aggressively, seeking to embarrass the United States. I think that's something we have to be able to watch for. I think we need to be able to more carefully come forward with a sensible counterterrorism policy, because I worry that ISIS-K, and other ISIS affiliates, be they ones that have been inspired online or those that are trying to come up through our southern border, are going to attempt an attack before the election. So I still see national security, while not maybe the top issue in the campaign, it's up there in a second tier of issues, and it could possibly go higher.
The Congress passed a $60 billion aid package for Ukraine. Is that enough for Ukraine to get into a better position or even win against Russia, or get it to a point where an end to the conflict is possible for something that Ukraine could accept?
I wish it were. I think it's just going to get them into 2025, and things are going to have to regularize. I don't see the United States having enormous $60 billion outlays like we've done the last few years. I think it'll be a much lesser figure going forward. Europe is stepping up. I think that is some of the news that we haven't realized. We all want them to do more for NATO and do more for Ukraine. They are beginning to get there. And Ukraine is stepping up. They have foreign defense contractors who are beginning to relocate to Ukraine, and they are beginning to take on more of the burden of their own defense. And so over time, I think we'll have to step up for Ukraine, but it'll be in a more regularized, thoughtful way, more like we do for Israel every year than these enormous outlays like we did for Afghanistan, Iraq, and now Ukraine.
Fascinating. And thank you so much for that. I've got a quick one question. That's how we dismount from this podcast. It's multiple choice. It's like a little pop quiz.
Mm-hmm.
You ready? What language did President Herbert Hoover use to speak with his wife, Lou, when he wanted a private conversation in the White House? Was it French, Spanish, or Mandarin?
I'm going to guess Mandarin.
Yeah, I didn't know this either. Herbert and Lou Hoover lived in China before living in the White House. And while there, he survived the Boxer Rebellion and apparently learned Mandarin.
Fascinating.
Now we know.
I love it.
Now we know, indeed.
You should be on Jeopardy.
No, I just read these. Michael, thank you so much. We appreciate you being on Perino on Politics.
Thanks for having me.
Listen ad-free with a Fox News Podcast Plus subscription on Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Prime members can listen to this show ad-free on the Amazon Music app.